Hey, it's. I see you there. Hello.
I'm here. I'm in the street.
Either that or you have a really nice paper behind you.
No, went to do some shopping for my wife.
That's good. Shalom bias works all the time.
All the time. I'll be home soon, so. Right. Nice weather, Baruch Hashem, after the last couple of days.
Yeah.
How was the yontif for the Rebbe?
Baruch Hashem, beautiful. Different, but beautiful.
I was by my daughter in Inwood.
Ah, okay.
And their shul was just after the orange zone, so they had to be on their toes, but they were good. Also, not the same. Very different, but it was very nice just to be with the grandchildren.
Keep on masks.
All masks and distancing, and they had 2 sets of hakafis, one for those that didn't want to stay around, and the other for the younger kids. The bar mitzvah age, high school,
Right.
basically for later on.
Mm-hmm.
So this old man stayed, did the 7 hakafis, and went back home. So, Mitzvah Hashem next year by the hotel.
Amen. Wait to get some of the other people should be on shortly.
Shalom Aleichem, Rebbe.
Shalom Shleima. Good.
How are you?
Good. We got it's getting his daily exercise and.
Yeah. I wanted to ask the Rebbe a question. The Rebbe makes Kiddush Shalashudis on Shabbos.
Yeah.
When Shabbos is also Yontif, you also make Kiddush?
No. For Shalashudis, no. We divide the Suda in half. The second half we don't make Kiddush. That's that Shalashid, the Shalashidus on Shabbos Shabbos Yontif is an anomaly, because the truth of the matter is that that for instance we don't say any of the Shabbos mirrors except for Shalom Aleichem, right? But none of the others mirrors because you mevayish the Chag if you sing Shabbos mirrors. So do things that are, even when we say Shalom Aleichem, we say it quietly. When we do, we usually divide the Shabbos meal into half, but we don't. It's just, otherwise you could do it with Mazonis, but it's still. Or we can become Chabad and do it with Torah. I wonder if this is ready to go.
I'm ready.
Okay. I said we're going to go get to Tofar Shayan, the Hilchos Chanukah. From a deeper perspective, I had a chance. I spent a little bit of time going into more depth into the Torah on it. It's such a powerful perspective. So I would try and summarize it, because he's got so many different thoughts. And just this, it's like 2 paragraphs. It's because as we said, we saw yesterday, one of the remozim of Chanukah is because Chanukah Chafhei, and Chafhei is Koyes B'Chaz B'nai Yisrael, and that's the Birchas Ka'anim, and Matli Shokai and Gadol is and Ubanov were Ka'anim Gedolim, and therefore they were able to do the Neis Chanukah. He says it's not a coincidence that everything that the Kohanim that represent the Kohanim is the opposite of what the Yevanim and Mesiabnim wanted to do. He says because one of the creed that was almost there's several things that which they did which were caused Klal Yisrael to be ultimately Torah about Klal Yisrael was in their world perspective. They have what we call a preoccupation with materiality. The Greek philosophers and Greek mythology is a very Megushim Dika preoccupation. The word philosophy means the ability of the mind. If your mind can grasp it, it doesn't exist. And that was the problem with the philosophers, that they could interpret and reinterpret Torah and deny Torah, and therefore Shabbos and Torah and Mila and Chodesh Chodesh, these are all the things that they opposed, because their world is a world, as we call it, the Zohar called it a world of Orla, a world in with which everything is covered over by a barrier and obstacle, which ultimately leads to Choshech. And the Kohanim were given, this was the Matana that was given to Aaron HaKohen by Chanukah HaMishkan. Chanukah HaMishkan, to Aaron comes the famous Chazal that Rashi brings us, Gemara and Midrashim, talking about the dialogue between Aaron HaKohen and the Kodesh Baruch Hu, where Aaron says, all the Nesiim and all the other Shvatim had the Chelik and Chanukah HaMishkan. He says, and Aaron and Shevet Levi were not part of the Chanukah HaMishkan, other than they did the Avodah. So Aaron became a star. He was hurt. Aaron, so Kodesh Baruch Hu says, don't worry, Shalcha Yosem Mishalahem. What you have is greater. You're going to have Alois Chasaneros. That's going to be La'ayram Vad B'Klal Yisrael. There'll always be Alois Chasaneros, and therefore Ner Chanukah is the Haftacha to Aaron HaKohen that he and all of his future generations will generate the the Ner Chanukah, the Neris, to bring light into the world, which is the opposite of the Choshech that the Yevanim will have. And he says it's not a coincidence that that the Oishis of Levi, 3 letters, the opposite of Yavan. There's a parallel between, or we say these are 2 opposites. He also brings an interesting gematria, and I tested it out because it's just it was too good of a gematria to overlook. Chayse Baruch Hu S is the same gematria as Master Matishu, one of Kislev. About 1054, 1055. Either I'm off one, or the gematria is allowed to be off one. But he says, but the Birchas Kohanim and the Matishu Bonov is the culmination of, or not culmination, is fulfillment of the Haftacha to Aaron HaKohen by the Chanukah HaMishkan. And so then every time that we do Ner Chanukah, we are being, regenerating the Chanukah HaMishkan all over again. We are bringing in the Neris of the menorah back into our world, and that's why Pesum Manis is so important, because it's to create not just the memory of the Chashman Oim, but what they did was brought the light back into Klal Yisrael. They brought the Or HaTorah or Mila, right? They brought these Oras back into Klal Yisrael, which was exactly opposite what they didn't. The reason why the Yevanim didn't want Mila is because they believe that the human body is all that you have to be concerned with, the perfection of the human body. And therefore, cutting off the Arla, coming off by the Bris Milah, is what's called damaging that wholeness of the human body. And Chazal tells us that was that was the difference. We know that was the difference. That's the famous argument the Gemara brings between Rabbi Kiva and Turnus Rufus. He asked him, he says, why are you ruining what your creator made first? Your creator made you complete, and you're ruining it. So he brought him. He says he brought a gluski, he brought a loaf of bread, and he brought chitim. He said, "Which one do you want? You want the wheat berries, or you want the loaf of bread?" He said, "Of course, I want the loaf of berries." He said, "Why not? Why do you want loaf of berries? The wheat berries is the way that Hashem created it. Except for that, you see that we're supposed to take what Hashem gave us and do something with it, right?" They wanted to keep the orla of the world intact. They want to keep the limitation of the human being to be stuck into the physical, into the material world. And the menorah is just the opposite. The menorah is how to bring light, have a greater light, that's a source of or into the chashchus of this world. And therefore the Kohanim so the Nes of Chanukah had to happen through the Kohanim. It says, and therefore they were zeicher to have the Malchus for 200 years, even if there were tainas on their Malchus, but still what they were able to do was bring, and ultimately, as the Gemara tells us, that Herdus, who is we call the continuation of the Malchus Chashmonaim, even though it wasn't from the Malchus, it wasn't really part of the Chashmonaim, but he continued it, would build the most magnificent Beis HaMikdash. The thing that everyone would say, the light of the world comes through there. Whoever didn't see a Beis HaMikdash or heard is built, never saw something so beautiful in his life. Never saw a beautiful building in his life. So he says, so the koyach of the Kohanim, and that was his tikkun for having wiped out most of the Sanhedrin and Malchus Beis David. It was to bring basically where he could have done something else. He says no. Yehuda ben Baba told him, you got to build a Beis HaMikdash. You have to make it the makom for the Kohanim to be able to be at the highest of the experience of Klal Yisrael. So he says, so the Yevonim represented not only Orla, but a tremendous amount of gaiva, a tremendous amount of arrogance, the arrogance of their way of their whole perspective on life. He says, and the Baruch Shem says the reason why Hashem chose Adam, he says he brings a medrash. The Baruch Shem asked Adam, he says, Adam gave names to all of the animals. So the Baruch Shem says, Ata ma shemcha? What should we call you? So he says, Adam can Adam in a sense because I was made from the Adam. I was made from the Adama. So the Baruch Shem says, this is for somebody who can see himself as being as lowly as the Adama is royal to give them the Chayin Nitzchi. So that, and what was the Chait? The Chait of the Nachash was V'yisram Kelokim. I'm going to make you very powerful. So this is the moment that they caught him caught up in Gaiva. There was the Gaiva was what caused the entire Chait. The need to be able to feel that they had their own independent source of power. The Nachash told him, "You're going to be." That the reason Baruch Shem is who he is. The Adon is because he ate from the Eitz Hadas first. So now you want to be like him. You have to also eat from the Eitz Hadas. Says the moment that he says you're going to be some killing people, the guy, but then the Nachash already had him. The moment that they experienced or listened to the attraction of Gaiva, says that was the undoing, that was the chait. Says, and that's what Klal Yisrael had to go through Shibud Mitzrayim and go through becoming Avadim and have to come out of Mitzrayim with Tzabach and the people. He says they had to go through Shibud Mitzrayim in order to learn how to become Am that's roy for Torah. They had to be Be'anivas. That's why Har Sinai was the lowest of the mountains, etc. The Klal Yisrael, for Klal Yisrael, Gaiva is toxic, and that's what the Chatum told the Erev told in Israel. Nasalon Elohim. We can make God. We can create. We can be powerful. We can be as powerful. That's the moment that the Chatum got that Gaiva into Klal Yisrael, even after 40 days of Pascha Zuamasan, the Gaiva would bring back the Zuama, bring back the Zuama Sanochash. So he says, so Aaron HaKohen represents the ultimate anivus. Aaron represents the ultimate of anivus at the lowest level, because that's why he was able to be Ois Shalom ben Adam Chaver ben Ish Ishtoi. Because if you want to try and bring peace, the one thing you can't do is inject your own ego into somebody else's issues. You have to be able to help them. You have to almost say, the person says, I'm nothing, I'm here to help you unconditionally. I'm here to help you without any of my own gears. I'm to have to be able to see what will work for you. If the thing will work for you, that's the level of Aaron HaKohen. So Aaron HaKohen would then take off his big day kuna. This is at least what it sounds like from the Torah records, that Aaron HaKohen would take off his big day kuna and go mix among the people to see how to bring Shalom ben Adam Chaver. He would take off the begonim, the avnate, and wrap himself around with a simple rope and go on and make Shalom ben Adam Chaver. So he says, so therefore, as Chazal tell us, we saw in the Mishnah Berurah, that Chav Hei Kislev was the real day of the initial Chanukah Mishkan. They just, because everything was brought to Moshe Rabbeinu on Chav Hei Kislev. And that's because that was the moment where Moshe was machanech the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash. That's when he did the Mashiach of the Shemin HaKodesh on the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash on Chav Hei Kislev. He says Chav Hei Kislev was the return to Aaron HaKohen of the Kiddush of Klal Yisrael. It didn't have to be ready. It didn't have to do it. As long as it was there, it was without arrogance. It was without gaiva, without even hispyrus. And Klal Yisrael didn't have to say, "Oh, look what we did. We accomplished. We did. We made it." He said, "You know what? Leave the kelim here until Nisan." Okay? You have all the kelim here. With Chav Hei Kislev, we can acknowledge that Aaron HaKohen doesn't need to make things happen. He just needs that they should all be ready to be used, to be over to be of Hashem whenever the Ron Hashem wants it to happen. So therefore, when the Pach Shaman of the it had to be the Pach Shaman with the Chaysim of the Kohen Gadol, even though Halacha they didn't need it, right? Because they entered into the Beis Hamikdash, they were all still Tamei Mesim, right? They didn't have a menorah, didn't have to have the Taharas Hamikdash. They entered in Klal Yisrael and took out all the tumah out of the Beis Hamikdash. They were just their warriors that came straight out of the battles. There wasn't even time for them to be Makadosh Asma. They didn't have to be, because it was Tumah Chutra B'tzibur. So if Tumah Chutra B'tzibur, then Klal Yisrael was at a point they technically didn't need a Pach Shemen with the Chaysim Kohen Gadol. But since the whole process of the menorah comes only through the mice of Aaron HaKohen, so therefore it had to have the oil, had to have the Pach Shemen, it had to be Chaysom Shel Kohen Gadol. It had to have the Chaysom of the Kohen Gadol because of that. Because there's no way that was the key. They have the Chaysim of the Kohen Gadol. Now they're able to bring the oil of Aaron HaKohen back into the Beis Hamikdash without anything else being ready. Because they didn't have menorah, they took their spears and stuck them into a piece of wood and created a quasi menorah. Right? Put cups on top of it and lit the menorah, and Hashem took it one day and said, "This is the Or of Aaron HaKohen. Doesn't need to have more to light than the ruchnius of Aaron HaKohen, the koach Or of Aaron HaKohen." This is and the way he puts it, he says that when in the dialogue between Aaron Cohen and Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rebbeinu Shalom, where the Rebbeinu Shalom is maftichim that it's over good. He says Aaron wasn't asking for his own gedula. He says Aaron was saying, he says, I am the Nasi of Shevet Levi. And right now Shevet Levi is not offering anything to add to the Chanukah Samishkan. So that's what Rebbeinu Shalom answered. He says Shevet Levi will carry that light, and that's what Levi will be the one who opposes Yavan. Because these are what Shevet Levi and the willingness to be Moshe Nefesh for Klal Yisrael, for Kedusha of Klal Yisrael, that's the power that opposes Yavan. And in our times, we are living in a world with which we are entering into a world again to an era of darkness. But we're now moving towards Chanukah, so we can start preparing ourselves for the hour of Chanukah. We can prepare ourselves because we're going to have to battle a tremendous, in the next couple of months, it will probably be a tremendous amount of chashchus. We're entering into a period of cheshach, hester upon him. And therefore, the hour of Chanukah is even more important and relevant than almost any other time in our, at least our current history. And that's why we find that there were a number of stories throughout the Holocaust that Eden managed to keep Neres Chanukah going even in the concentration camps. The Buzrugov found that they get potatoes and they got this oil and they took threads from the clothing and they made wicks from it. Tremendous amount of Mesiras Nefesh into the Neres of Chanukah. Because the Neres of Chanukah is the light that shines through the chashchus of our world. And so he says that he came to Aaron Cohen's request from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that Shevet Levi should have its chelik in Chanukah Hamishkan was because he says without that they're going to say is that the reason why Shevet Levi didn't have chelik in Chanukah Hamishkan was because of Aaron Cohen's own flaws. His participation in the Chet Egel, the Rebbeinu says, no, he says that anivus, that humility that Aaron Cohen would say, it's not for me, I'm not looking for my own kavod. I'm looking for the kavod of Klal Yisrael, I'm looking for the kavod of Shevet Levi. That's the meat of the Neres of Chanukah that the Rebbeinu says, that's the ner that has to endure. Throughout the history of Klal Yisrael will be the anivus of Ner Chanukah. And the Ner Chanukah can be lit in the most simple menorah. It doesn't require a silver or a gold menorah, a fancy menorah. 8 cups, 8 simple glass cups, 8 potatoes. That's enough for the Ner Chanukah. There's, and if I told them the story, Sam mentioned a little bit in shul. There was a story that one of Rechil Spiro's stories. He says he heard the story from first. My wife knows the family back in the old time. His name was in Antwerp. There was a young man that grew up. His name was Meir Yaakov Kanner. Meir Yaakov Kanner's father and my shver were very close. And his uncle and they were real close. The families were very close to each other. I don't know if it was before the war, but after the war for sure. He grew up in Antwerp. In Antwerp, there was a Yid by the name of Yecheskel Gelbshuf. Yecheskel was a Holocaust survivor and didn't have any children. So he became like among the survivors in Antwerp. He was like the Zaidi of the Kehillah. He would play with the children. He would take them on lap. He would give them. There was somebody who was a a warm beacon of light to the entire generation growing up after the Holocaust in Antwerp. So Meir Yaakov was always very close to him. He was, but then eventually went off to Eretz Yisrael, and Bechaskel was nifter in 1976. And they said, Yaakov said, when you heard that he was nifter, it was sad that there's somebody who had been such a warm part of his childhood. He was reading the Sefer Mekadesh Hashem from the Weitzner. The Mekadesh Hashem has an introduction. The Weitzner wrote his experiences besides the Shalos and Shuvas of Mekadesh Hashem, he brings us his whole history of his experience in Auschwitz and how he was freed. It's good reading for both Simchas Torah and Tisha B'Av. There's lots of important pieces. So he says he was reading that in Auschwitz, the Weitzner had a pair of tefillin. It was the only pair of tefillin. Everybody, the few people knew there was a pair of tefillin in Auschwitz. Weitzner and his friend, his last name was Stern, of Herschel Stern, I think. I'll have to look at the story. We're the only two people who knew about the tefillin. And every once in a while, Sissa said that there was one in Auschwitz. Auschwitz wasn't only for Eden. Auschwitz, the part of Auschwitz was for political prisoners as well. So among the political prisoners was a Polak by the name of Wiecznak. Wiecznak was a Polish guy who, because they were political prisoners, they were treated much better than the Eden. And this Wiecznak was Bielacek. I'm sorry, Bielacek was his name. Bielacek was Wilhelm or Will in Polish. Bielacek. He came over to the Weitzner and he said, "Listen, Rabbi, I want you to know, I was the Shabbos guy in my community, so I know everything about the Jewish customs. If there's anything I can do to help, I'll be glad to help." He once came over to the Weitzner and he said, "Rabbi, it says it's Shabbos afternoon. I know that you have a custom of eating eggs and onions Shabbos afternoon. Why aren't you doing it?" He says, "You kidding? In Auschwitz, how are we going to get eggs and onions in Auschwitz?" He says, "Rabbi, I have a way with the kitchen. From that point on, every Shabbos he would bring bites in the room, a couple of eggs and onions. They would have eggs and onions." When they went on the death march, this Bielacek was there to help along. They came to near Brandenburg. That's where they marched to Brandenburg, in Germany. He came over to the right side and he says, "Rabbi, it's winter outside. It was a cold winter, December." He says, aren't you supposed to light Chanukah candles?" He says, "Oh, we're in the fields around Brandenburg." He says, "Don't worry about it." And they brought him candles, and they in Brandenburg in the fields in the cold, they had Chanukah. The only person that says Rabbi Stern, after the war was over, he came over to the Weitzner and says, "Weitzner, I want to let you know, this Bielacek was not a goy." He says, because they were together when the Nazis came to round up their town. Except that this Bielacek happened to have some Polish papers, and I told him, "You have Polish papers, pretend you're a goy. You'll be able to accomplish more pretending you're a goy than being a Yid." It says, and that's what he did throughout the war. He pretended he was a Polish goy, and he did tovas for Yid, and he saved many, many lives in Auschwitz. So after the Milchama, this Rabbi Stern came over he says, this Bielacek was a Yid. He says, "You notice there were times when your tefillin was missing." He says, "Yeah, I thought that the Nazis had found it." He says, "But it always managed to come back So you got to know this real chick put on tefillin every single day. He would borrow you when you were out working. He would come in and put on tefillin every single day. What was his name? Cheskel Goldstuff. He says the person who was Moshe Nefesh for Klal Yisrael in a way that was almost impossible to take place, other than that he put himself in a place where he could serve, hold on to Eden, to be able to hold on and save Eden and be able to provide for them to the best that he could possibly do that. So I thought about the Neres Chanukah. The Neres Chanukah were for Klal Yisrael was the Ar that has dispelled the Cheshach. And Bez Hashem, as we learn Hilchos Chanukah, we should be able to bring the light of Neres Chanukah back into our world. And Bez Hashem, we'll be able to get into the greatness of the light, of the menorah, and how and why it is such an essential piece that would pose. We see a world of Cheshach that doesn't want to believe in God. They don't want to have God in the world. They want to pride themselves in the oneness of humanity and lose everything else that to offer. All right, tomorrow we'll go on to Tafei Shayin Aleph. We'll do First Mishabur and we'll go on some more of the Inyanim of Neres Chanukah. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Yeshkoyach, Rebbe. Thank you very much. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Take care.
Kol tov.
Have a great day.